Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Caoilinn Hughes, and I'm the Assistant Director here at Glucksman Ireland House at NYU. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening for the launch of Caoilinn Hughes' latest novel, The Alternatives. If I could just ask that everyone silence any electronic devices at this time, just so you all know, we will be recording the event this evening. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this has not been a normal week here at New York University, and many members of our community are in pain. As students, staff, and faculty who constitute the university, we made a conscientious decision to move forward with this event tonight in an opportunity to gather and center community within the house this evening. Caoilinn and Kelly will be in conversation for about 30 to 35 minutes, followed by a reading from the book. We'll then open the conversation to the audience for a Q&A. The evening will close with a book signing and an opportunity to meet Caoilinn. On this particular occasion, though, and under the present circumstances, we will not be hosting our typical wine and cheese reception afterwards. So The Alternatives, the reason we're all here this evening. It's fresh off the printer. It's just published on April 16th. Is that right? Just a couple of weeks ago. Writing in the New York Times, S. Kirk Walsh calls The Alternatives, quote, a bold, beautiful, complex novel. And I can't wait to read what Hughes writes next. She too is an unstoppable force. So Caoilinn Hughes is the author of novels The Wild Laughter, which won the Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award and was longlisted for the International Dylan Thomas Prize, and The Orchid and the Wasp, which won the Collier-Bristow Prize and was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award. Her poetry collection, Gathering Evidence, won the Irish Times Shine Strong Award. Her short fiction has won an O. Henry Prize, the Moth Short Story Award, and the Short Story of the Year at the Irish Book Awards in 2020. She was recently the Oscar Wilde Center Writer Fellow at Trinity College Dublin, and she's presently a Coleman Fellow at the New York Public Library. The Alternatives is her third novel. Kelly Sullivan is Clinical Associate Professor in Irish Studies at Glucksman Ireland House at New York University. Her recent publications include Elizabeth Bowen and 1916, An Architecture of Suspense in Modernism, Modernity, Print Plus, Yeats's Birds, Recognizing the Animal in Modernist Cultures, Elizabeth Bowen and the Politics of Consent in Irish University Review, as well as interviews with 9 contemporary Irish poets for the special issue of Air Ireland on Seamus Heaney's Afterlives. She co-edited the 2020 issue of Air Ireland on Ireland and the Environment, and her writing on Irish artist Harry Clarke has appeared in the Public Domain Review. Harry Clarke and Artistic Visions of the Irish Free State and Elsewhere. She's currently working on a book on the Irish writer Molly Keane. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Kelly. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Can you guys hear me okay? It's very weird to have a mic attached to your head, not really be able to hear yourself. Well, I wanted to start out by saying congratulations, Caoilinn, on this fabulous book, which I really loved. And I want to admit at the beginning that I'm quite, intimidated talking to you about this novel because it's so smart and so funny and so wide-ranging. And you write 3/4 of the way through, you have a character say there's no such thing as a neutral question. The ask always says something of the asker. So I'm already quite concerned about everything I'm going to ask you tonight. But I thought we could just start with the basics and kind of the characters who make up this novel, because it is a novel of ideas in a lot of ways, but it's also really character driven. So you have these 4 sisters who all have PhDs, 1 honorary, are all single, and one of them goes missing. And they're all, to me, so fascinating and carefully drawn and different from each other. They all have different kinds of PhDs and different kinds of careers. Did one of them come first? And then if so, how did you get to the others?
Yeah, I did. One did come first. Alwyn, is it a little loud? I'll do that.
Just to us.
Okay, just to us. Alwyn Flattery, yeah. So I wanted to write about women at work. women kind of expressing themselves through their professions, whose work kind of gives them anchorage and purpose. And I started with Alwyn Flattery, who is a geologist. And I find that to be such meaningful existential work, kind of looking at the landscape, trying to understand how it got that way, what life it sustained, trying to be able to read the landscape for our role in the story, if we have any role at all. And I was writing the book in Connemara on the west coast of Ireland. I grew up on the west coast of Ireland in Galway, and I was writing a lot of the book there. And I don't know how many people in the room have been to that landscape, but it's I find it's so emotionally loaded for me. But I find it to be one of the most beautiful landscapes that I've ever seen. So you have this kind of limestone shouldering through the fields everywhere. You know, you can tell that it must have been so difficult, you know, during the famine, because the soil is so shallow and there's just so much rock. It's really geology to the fore, and the weather is so intense there, because it's just the Atlantic just dumps on it. So everything is stripped of trees, all of these low-lying hills, and it's in a way a really wild and dynamic landscape, but at the same time immovable. And that is very much a description of Alwyn. So I started with Alwyn, and I had a sense that I was writing about women at work. And then I thought, well, she had big sister vibes, you know, and I thought, well, why not have a book about about women at work be also a book about family? You know, those two things don't need to be kind of polar opposites. And I like the idea that a book about a geologist, a philosopher, a political scientist, and a chef was also a book about sisters, and they definitely walk into a bar.
They do.
Yeah.
And it does become kind of a family comic drama, I suppose, or a drama with comic moments in it. And a kind of a lot of that drama takes place in either a bar or in a house, in a space, kind of a constricted space, I suppose. But it's interesting that they're all sisters. The family dynamic is sisters, not kind of intergenerational so much.
This is true, yeah.
Yeah. I want to get to the structure. I want to ask you about the structure of the novel, but I'm going to save that question, which kind of links back to the family drama and the tensions around that. They're all women who work, and work is really central to their identities, I think, in healthy and unhealthy ways, perhaps. It's also a novel about teaching. Like, there's a lot of teaching in it. How was it to write the teaching scenes, and why is that important to you to have that in the novel, or was that just a part of their character?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a challenge to not, you know, just it could have been called The Unlikables as soon as you have a bunch of smart women teaching. But I in a way I found that humorous to begin with. I thought, you know, this is just, you know, absolutely material that a publisher is going to run away from. But I also I knew that it would be funny. There was something about Alwyn's character from the start. She set the tone, you know, it's not a comedy, but I think in Ireland there's such a tradition of the tragicomic that I was kind of writing into that. But that's not what you asked me about. You asked me about
just the teaching
teaching
and how you.
Yeah, so I think, you know, as much as it is a very specific thing that 3 out of the 4 sisters teach, I think we've all had experiences of teaching or being taught, and enough to know that it involves so much more than the transfer of information. You know, it's really about the careful handling of students' mental health, their participation skills, their critical thinking, and really you're kind of you're a guardian of the truth, or you're at least attempting to be. And so I find it to be, you know, such an important role to have in the world. But it's also, I think, if you're teaching, you're also searching for meaning, and you're searching for explanation, and it's an endeavor rather than a kind of final state. But they are all teaching in different scenarios, and they with different degrees of privilege and institutional support. So one of the sisters is Well, the three sisters who teach, Alwyn, who teaches geology, is a tenured professor in the west coast of Ireland, and she has been contending with the collapse of deep time, where processes that should take place over millennia are taking place over decades. And she's dealing with a very frightened cohort of students. It's essentially kind of become a climate class.
Mm.
And then her second to youngest sister, Maeve, is the one whose PhD is honorary. She's a chef. She's kind of an Instagram. She lives on a houseboat in London. She's the one who gets
mime
slagged by
artist.
the other sisters. Yes, a mime artist lives on the deck of her boat, a Bosnian mime artist. And then the other two sisters who teach are Nell, who's a philosopher. She's been adjuncting at various Connecticut universities for 15 years, over 15 years. And she's the one who is, I suppose, contending with the trickiest setup as a teacher. You take your office hours at a flexi desk. You can't really afford to live close enough to campus, so you don't have a commuter's allowance. There's no kind of sense of security, or you don't have any autonomy over the conditions of your work. But she's actually the one who's most fulfilled in her role in a way, because getting to be a philosopher is a very extraordinary thing, and there's really nowhere outside of the academy that you can do that job. And then the other sister who teaches, Rona, is maybe in the most privileged position. She teaches at Trinity College in Dublin. She's a political scientist, and she's a single mum, and her work is around direct democracy. Specifically, she's really interested in citizens' assemblies, so she is also a kind of talking head in Ireland, and she has a lot of kind of social capital. She's in the background donating untold sums to have seawall defenses constructed to protect her shoreside mansion. So there's that.
And she's aside from Maeve, the chef, she's the one sister who doesn't actually teach in a classroom.
We don't see her
setting.
in the no, yeah.
She doesn't have to anymore. She's beyond that.
Yeah, we have like it begins with you're in a lab with students, and so a kind of equivalent of a lecture, and then they go on a field trip together. Then later on, there's a full-on lecture on happiness that Nell gives, and about Aristotle and Epicurus. And then there's she also does a Zoom lecture about Heidegger and care. So bestseller, here I come.
But I think what's remarkable to me about the way you've drawn these characters is like you totally inhabit them in their chapters or in their scenes. So I totally bought that you were a philosopher and knew all about Heidegger and Care. And I mean, probably you do, but you've sort of managed to have these characters both be representative of certain fields of study or fields of interest, but also like they're dynamic and make sense as people who'd be drawn to what they're teaching or doing in the different ways that they're teaching and doing them. You mentioned, well, a couple of things I wanted to, I guess, pick up on knowledge, I guess, and the kind of, giving of knowledge in a classroom and how that's really not what happens, or it's a small part of what happens in teaching. And I wonder, I think the word responsibility probably never comes up in the book, but it seems also like it's a book that's about how responsible are we to the knowledge that we have about whatever it is we're knowledgeable about. Was that on your mind in writing it, or is that getting, I mean, it's awkward to ask questions like this, right? Because that's, if it was, you're not gonna want us to read it and find it out. But
I think, yeah, I never set out with, an agenda for any themes it really all comes from the character. But it's true that they are all trying to do meaningful or fulfilling work. And obviously they are in the privileged position of being able to try and do that. That's not the case for everyone. As opposed to, working for BP or or having a job that, you might find in David Graeber's bullshit jobs. There's a lot of those jobs. And so it is a choice. I think, Nell could have she could have a really cushy corporate job, and she's choosing not to. So there is an element of choice in that. And then they're not just doing it for their own pleasure. So there is an element of them trying to do something that involves improving the world. They're all contending with different structural problems, you know. Nell with the commercialization of the academy, Rona with a weakening democracy, um, Alwyn with the collapse of deep time and this, you know, these frightened students, and Maeve with a volatile food system, an increasingly volatile food system, and food nationalism. She started working around local produce, and she ends up getting herself into some really funky areas in England. And so those kind of structural challenges are all embedded in their jobs, and they get kind of steered towards them. And in a way, they influence one another. That's one way that they influence one another as siblings, you know. I'm interested in that kind of dynamic, like what kind of magnet, if your siblings, if you have them, are a kind of magnet in your life and you're living far away from them, how might that magnet still be affecting you? And I think, you know, a lot of our morality gets developed, you know, early in life. And that's not to say it won't change radically, but I think that there's often a challenge, you know, that's why those relationships can be so fraught, because there's that constant value judgments going on among the choices that you've made.
You enact that in both the kind of dramas between the characters, or dramas may be the wrong word, but the tensions and the way that one character might have shaped another character, or told a character to do something in particular with, and the way that they collaborate with each other as well. But then the structure of the book, I don't think I'm giving away anything to talk a bit about the structure. We have individual chapters for each character in part one, but those kind of gradually condense so that characters have, there are two characters in a chapter, and they kind of play off of each other. So that I feel like there's a sort of an enacting of that that influence, I guess, of each other, or the reenacting of it.
Because I wanted them to, you know, to be individual. But I do think as siblings, you don't go around, you know, the world thinking of yourself as a sister, that, you know, only arrives in your head if you get a text message, you know, or, but so I wanted the book's structure to reflect that reality, that you are actually in your life. And then around your family, you are something else. And is it possible to maintain that? For the reader, I did that. I inserted them separately, you know, and you really get to know. And even as a reader, do you get to see them, or do they bleed into this, completely fraught image? It, not always negatively. It can be positively too, but just those roles that get assigned.
Well, one thing that the characters do to each other, and that the novel as a whole does to the characters, is hold them to account as well, right? They have ideas and, you know, thoughts about the world and the way things might be or should be, but the novel kind of forces them to reckon with what they're thinking and working through. And sometimes the sisters do that to each other, but sometimes it's outside forces that you've put upon them. But you're not easy on them.
No, even a cab driver, it can be, you know, can challenge the ethics of the catering gig you're about to go and deliver.
Yeah, which is one of the best scenes ever. The catering event is fabulous. It's dark, but it's funny.
Yeah, so Maeve the chef has a publishing contract. She got approached by an editor because of her platform on Instagram. And she collaborates with her sister. She originally began as a solution to homesickness, now living in Connecticut. Maeve would make these meals kind of nostalgic of their childhood meals. Their parents died really young, so they basically brought one another up. And Maeve was the one who cooked for them. And Nell would watch her in the middle of the night making these meals, and she'd be kind of philosophizing so it was a kind of a conversation that was happening between the two sisters in the dark of night that was meant just for them, but there was something about, and Maeve just posted them on Instagram, because on Instagram Live, that's how they did it, and it just kind of blew up. She has this 3-book deal, and in where you meet her and where she is in her life, that she's trying to get the publisher to agree to the 3rd book, which is called Feasting on Scarcity. And so it was a Brexit Britain food kind of trilogy. And so they're obviously wanting the advance back. And she does not have the advance left to give them back. So they've asked her to kind of cater to these influential people in Britain to essentially see if they it's a little bit of a power game between herself and the publisher. Yeah, so that's the scene that
Yeah.
Kelly's referring to. Sometimes I read from it, but I'm not going to read from it tonight because it's very cancelable. There's lots of British accents in it, which I'm very, very more than happy to do when it's not being recorded.
The mention of Brexit makes me think about how contemporary the novel is, and that it's, I mean, it's set in the summer of 2003 or
2023. I tried
2023.
to
I'm
set.
still in 2003.
I know. I tried to set it like now,
Yeah.
when the book would be published, and I missed by like 9 months or something. But and that process actually, because I felt it's just so urgent. Everything is changing so rapidly. And you know, I kind of told myself that it's a privilege to be able to write about, you know, 10 years ago, and it was a privilege I was going to deprive myself of for this book, not necessarily for the next one, but because I just felt, you know, can we really afford the processing time, you know? And so that the attempt to write the book set in 2023 meant that I had to kind of get the current moment right, but also anticipate what was about to happen. And that process actually in the writing reflected what the book is about, which is that effort to lurch forward in the story as the carpet's being pulled from beneath your feet. So it was a weird marrying of form and subject in a way.
There's like a few mentions of COVID, but it's, you know, it's in no way a COVID novel, but I assumed that happened during the process of writing, right? That you started it before 2020.
It did, yeah. We have Maeve's great abstention of 2020 comes up. There are these little references to COVID.
Yeah. You also, well, you talk about urgency, you know, and making it so contemporary and trying to kind of react to the carpet being pulled out from under our feet moment to moment. There's also maybe a narrative around fear. I wonder if you could talk about that at all. Not that it's about fear, but responding to one's fears, individual and collective. I mean, particularly say with the students, but also with some of the sisters.
Yeah, definitely. Alwyn is kind of struggling to hold steady. I used to think about the earth sciences as being a really romantic for kind of life. Geography was my favorite subject in school, but I got a C in the end, because and that was, you know, doing well for me in school. But I had answered a question about a Mediterranean country. It was like, write about the rivers of some Mediterranean country, and I was like, Belgium. Is the one that I know, the rivers. So, I wrote about Belgium, and I got 0 for that. But I did love geography, and if I had another life, I think something out in the world, like that. But now, I mean, it's hard to be a romantic earth scientist now. You know, you're contending with obviously catastrophic climate change, with a degraded topography. And, you know, it's not new. There was this book called The Sand County Almanac. Now, the author is just popping out of my mind.
Otto Leopold.
Yeah. And it was written in like 1940. And there's a line in that about, I just remember reading that a few years ago. And there's a line about to have a education in ecology is to be alone in a dying world, or to be, you know, it's just so heartbreaking. And as in kind of a contemporary equivalence in a beautiful book called Rewilding by Isabella Tree, right at the end of that book, which is extraordinary, where she talks about the loneliness of knowing, of looking around and knowing what's happening and trying to find. My partner is an environmental scientist, and I do remember, you know, many periods of like taking him for a consolatory walk and not being able to find like 1 square inch that was safe, that didn't tell a horrible story. And so weirdly, that was more terrifying when fewer people knew about it. And I do think there's been a massive escalation in awareness about the climate crisis. And I think that is actually really hopeful, because, and in a way, COVID kind of showed us that we can halt our inertia this feeling of just,
Yeah.
you know, people are unchangeable, and stubborn. People were willing to change when they realized that they were under threat and that other people were under threat. And so there's that's all. That's all to say that, yeah, fear is definitely part of it. And with Alwyn's character, she is constantly having to project optimism. And there's something really, even if you have found optimism, because, you know, which is obviously, you know, a verb, I mean it in the sense of a verb, rather than a way of being or a perspective, you still, it's still very bleak to think that you're obliged to speak a certain way. And so I wanted to, and she grew up without adults in the room, so in a way they're really primed for contending with the moment that we're in. And that's partly, I suppose, why it wasn't a conscious decision at the beginning, but the more I went through the book, the more I realized that that was the case. You know, they're already familiar with the stages of grief, and they know that the last stage when it comes to the environment can't be acceptance. And so each of the sisters are responding differently. And there are so many different ways to respond, you know, from like grief and despair and shame and anger, rage, to reaching out for community, to changing your own behaviors, to engaging in change-making action. And so I'm interested in the ways that individuals are responding to the crisis that we're in. I do think that it's also, we are now living in a time that has more general pessimism, I think, than any time in history. I obviously can't speak for specific groups of people in history, but if you were to take an average, I would, you know, an average of the human species, it feels like there's got to be more general pessimism about the future. And that's something that we're living through. And I think it doesn't mean that writing art about now, like that this moment is any less worthy of considering and spending time with. You know, this is when we are alive. And so, you know, I did, there's a feeling of alongside fear, I think there's a feeling of ugliness and self-loathing that people are experiencing right now. And I do think that that's worth acknowledging, in the same way that I think I was writing about cynicism with Orchid and the Wasp, which is something that's really an ugly emotion, or, you know, and set of beliefs. But that you know, book was really around like the post-crash, the 2011, those years. And I think now we are in a different phase. And yeah.
Maybe to lighten it just ever so slightly, the novel is also really funny in a lot of moments. And why is the humor important to you, or why is it in there, aside from, I mean, it's funny and it's entertaining in a way, but that's not its whole purpose, I don't think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know about purpose. I just, as a reader, I really love reading books that have quite a lot of humor in them.
Yeah.
Even if they're tragedies, even if they're really dark, I do think that people are funny. And I also think that it's our very best trait as a species. You know, I think other people might rank like resilience or like the ability to work together and you know, create community, all those things above. But for me, it's number one. Like, what makes us, you know, worthy of knowing? What makes us at all sexy? Like, sense of humor. That's the only thing. And so it's the thing. I think it's the reason that I write, because I can get outside of my own completely, you know, crap sense of humor and reach for other people's, you know, much more entertaining. And so I was getting energy from the characters, you know. I felt really grateful to them, especially during the COVID years. So I listen to this podcast every night, Kermode and Mayo's film review podcast. I don't know if there's anyone from the church in the group. No. Okay, there's a church. It's a huge podcast. Mark Kermode writes for The Guardian film reviews. Anyway, it's just, they've been friends for about like 35, 40 years, these two guys. And they call it wittertainment. And they just banter away. And I'm an insomniac, so I listen to them every night. But he has this test for comedies, which is the 6 laugh test. And he says if he doesn't laugh out loud 6 times, you know, not a comedy. It's not working. But for me, like I want the 6 laughs from every work of art, not just comedies. So it's something that I really, really value as a reader. And like I say, there is that tradition in Ireland of the that's kind of what I read growing up. And so it seems like a natural form. It's also, it's permissible. It's, it's allowed in high art in Irish culture. So I'm very lucky that that's the case.
The character Rona is she's very intriguing. She's the political scientist who's really interested in citizen assemblies, and you place her in a citizen assembly. It gets in a conversation
hall.
about them, a town hall meeting about them, and it gets a little tense, right, for her at a moment. And can I tell what happens? I probably shouldn't.
I don't know. It's very close to the end.
I won't tell. Okay, there's a little joke about seeing eye to eye, and it's very funny. But it also, I think, within the scene, it's funny to the audience as well, and it kind of breaks the tension that might otherwise be unbreakable.
Yeah.
Right? And so
it's a humanizing moment.
Yeah,
it's really funny
exactly.
because I've been getting it's like, this is kind of like, Sex in the City, but actually no sex in the country. Because I've been getting emails from people being like, I read your book, whatever, obviously I related most to Maeve, like everyone's gonna love Maeve. And then I get another email being like, I read your book, obviously related most to Nell, like everyone's gonna love Nell, and nobody has said Rona. I'm waiting for that one person. Like I'm gonna like meet them and like buy them dinner.
she's a fascinating character, but you're not easy on her either. You're not easy on any of them. I have no idea what time it is, but I did want to ask you about the play
Sure.
in the novel. So the structure of the novel, at one point we get a 2-act play broken up with some chapters in between. I know you're interested in, do you have an MA in theater, in Irish theater, or just theater generally?
In Irish theater.
Yeah. So I know you have a kind of background and interest in that. What was the impulse to put a play in there? Was it an idea you had early on, or did it come in the writing of the novel?
No, it definitely came in the writing. It came about 3 pages before it happened. I have emails that I sent to my friend being like, no, I have this horrible feeling that it wants to be a play. And I think it's because it was just an impulse. And I think it was because when the sisters come together, I could see and hear them, and there's just so much talk and crosstalk, competitive talk, and people trying to steer the conversation one way or like stay away from other topics. And there was so much being said that I needed to get out of their way. And the play script allowed me to do that. Also, I think if I were to write it in prose, the book would have been 200 pages longer, and it would have been a mismatch of the word count and the scope of the story. But yeah, I didn't know there was going to be another act. I didn't know if there would be a third. So I was really grateful to it.
That's so interesting. You didn't know there was going to be a second act.
No.
And I guess it's the first act has 4 scenes in it, right?
I don't know.
I believe so, based on my mapping of your novel. And the second act is just a single scene.
Sounds right. I believe you.
Do you want to read some of the novel?
Sure. Yeah, very happy to. I can stay seated because we've got I'm going to read from the opening, and so you don't need to know anything. You're going to meet Alwyn. The air is mild for October. Nothing shivers, nothing smokes. A gentle westerly whistles at the panes of the lab windows like an unwelcome uncle, determined to raise the hairs on some young neck. 20 necks bend to observe the experiment. A perspex prism, known as a squeeze box, the size of a narrow aquarium, is filled with thin layers of colored sand. This is where this idea comes from. The ends of the box are movable so that its contents can be compressed to demonstrate the effects of tectonic convergence. Thrusts, faults, folds, belts. Alwyn presses a fist to her mouth to stifle a burp, and a few students snicker. Lo and behold, geologic processes for the puny human attention span. There's something very bodily about Aoilinn Flattery that the undergraduates find wildly amusing. Moments earlier, she'd used a shard of slate to scratch her inner elbow psoriasis, and a puff of dead skin particles danced visibly in the ventilation. She placed the shard back in its tray and, with her chalky fingers, lifted out a teeny tiny sanitized kidney stone for the undergraduate's scrutiny. Moving this kidney stone involved a person's hospitalization, she tells them. Just imagine the force it would take to move a mountain. And we're not talking about violent, sudden processes like an earthquake shouldering up a mountain range. No, these forces are so incremental and immense, so imperceivable and unstoppable that there's no halting their progress. They're underway right now as we stand here on the shifting foundations of this institute. The students scan their pals for clues as to how to feel. They have learned to take what levity they can from these light and flaky moments, as Aoilinn's lectures so far have been something of a shockwave. We're a wreck, she says. Ireland is one big crash site, where the ancient continents, Laurentia and Gondwana, collided like two humongous cruise liners, long before the nouveau riche were evolved to populate them. The wreckage cut stupendously across this island, from Dingle in the west to Clogherhead in the east. The island was underwater back then, so that story didn't make itself known for millions of years. And here we stand, sifting through the evidence of that collision in our desk organisers, all of us above sea level, for another decade or two anyways. Several students begin to agitate in the pause that follows. It's hard to read the undergraduates, to know what's getting through, what with the scarves cobraed around their mouths and their minimal eye contact. They all seem hungover or stoned or just returned from a silent monetary meditation retreat in Bali they spent their loans on. But they also seem deeply unnerved, and it's not paranoia. How information is delivered seems to be more consequential than the information itself, Aoilinn thinks. She is losing her strength to hand it over gently. But a teacherly muscle memory prompts her now, having pushed, to pull. Have any of you seen it? She makes eye contact with each student in turn, in case, as first years, they need drawing out. Shauna, an exchange student with the gall of a parking enforcement officer, asks, "Is it here in Galway? Because car rental in this country is a joke." "It's not in the immediate vicinity, Shauna, but I saw the Rock of Gibraltar," Eric offers out of nowhere, a very tall student with asteroidal confidence. Aoilinn hears the clock on the wall tick forward a cluster of seconds all in one go, like heart palpitations. Harmless, but horrible. "If you tell me you flew down to the Rock of Gibraltar, Eric, when you haven't taken a bus to Dingle to ogle our own monumental bodies of rock." In the pause that follows, Eric takes a seat and runs his fingers through his gelled hair, leaving striations that seem almost infrastructural, as if water might collect in them. Aoilinn is grateful when a Fionnuala, not technically a mature student, but she has a lot of cop on, cuts in with something likely to be relevant. "I went to Edinburgh during the summer." "For the festival?" Geraldine clenches with envy. "Yeah," says Fionnuala, "but we took a day trip to Sicker Point." She glances at Aoilinn. "You did not." Aoilinn replaces a chunk of granite she'd been using as a stress ball back in the specimen tray, readying herself to shake Fionnuala's hand. Fionnuala smiles. Fionnuala, by the way, is in a wheelchair, you find out later. "It was a little tricky to get out onto the rock, but it was worth it." Aoilinn looks around the group. Does anyone know what historic expedition Fionnuala was honouring, trekking out to Sicker Point on Scotland's weather-battered coast when she could have stayed in Edinburgh town to watch shit-faced Shakespeare? Everyone laughs a bit, releasing some pressure. "Do you want to say, Fionnuala, what you saw there, and who saw it first?" Fionnuala pulls at a mini harmonica pendant, travelling it back and forth along the necklace. By the end of year one, Aoilinn will count herself a failure if Fionnuala hasn't replaced that pendant with a hand lens. Fionnuala acts a touch more flustered than she is. So James Hutton, I guess back in the 1700s, found these rock formations, these really crazy layered rocks, kind of like pastry, or maybe I just associate Scotland with pastry. Sedimentary rock, like the strata of coloured sands, Alwyn gestures in our squeeze box experiment. Exactly, yeah. And there were these horizontal layers like that, and then vertical layers too, side by side or on top of one another at right angles. And the vertical rocks and the horizontal formed in totally different ways in different time periods. And Hutton basically looked at them and instantly understood plate tectonics, or a theory that led to it. Or was it just that he knew the center of the earth was molten rock and that that was how new land was made instead of, God making it? Fionnuala keeps glancing to Alwyn for confirmation because before that, she presses on, he could see erosion happening and couldn't understand how all land hadn't just been washed away by the weather. Like, how is there anything left? And the only explanation anyone knew for new land was God. But when Hutton saw those rocks, he knew they were evidence that the earth was billions of years old instead of thousands, because the formations would have taken, a really, really long time. At Fionnuala's unsure expression, Alwyn nods with the restrained pride of a surgeon confirming that they got it all, that the patient has plenty of life ahead. She points to a laminated poster on the wall labeled Geologic Timescale, which breaks the history of the planet into units of time from lengthiest to briefest. The unit of time you're talking about, she says, for a really, really long time is an eon. Geraldine, with a cynicism out of sync with the affirmative badges on her backpack, says, "What's the bet Hutton didn't publish his theories because he was afraid of the Pope?" "He did one better than publish his theory," Alwyn says levelly. He published findings. First, he went cantering up the Highlands to find irrefutable evidence to bear the theory out. Physiological manifestations, brute facts. I should also add, I had saddle sores in here, which Cal made me get rid of because it was too much of a brute fact. But anyway, lots of saddle sores, poor Hutton. He found his proof at the meeting point of the two rivers, where pink granite, igneous rock, intrusive rock, spewed up as magma and cooled slowly, was mingled like cream in a soup of grey sandstone, sedimentary rock, accumulated over time on an ancient seabed. Thusly, as last year's undergraduates love to say, Hutton was able to throw the Judeo-Christian chronology of the earth out the lab window. Just another 1 minute. With a leery expression and a briny smell, Geraldine wafts the damp hooded towel she wears as a cape to help it dry from her morning sea swim. I'm pretty sure non-Western cultures knew the earth was billions of years old before some equestrian Scot in a ruff. That is a fabulous topic for a dissertation, Geraldine. I'm not the expert you want for that, but call into me during office hours and we'll talk interdisciplinary options. Alwyn waits until Geraldine nods. "I take a guess, though," Alwyn says then, "I take a guess that a few of them cultural theories about cycles and eternity involve higher powers. And Hutton's point was that no higher power was needed to create dramatic landscapes of deposition and compaction. An act of fault is a great rejuvenator. The earth is in a continual geologic process of destruction and repair, as long as there's still heat at the heart of it, as long as we stay near enough the sun, which drives so much surface geology. But before you go thinking the destruction around us is part of a natural process, oil took millions of years to accrue till we started boring holes in rocks and throwing in matches. And now, in under 200 years, we've burned up nearly all of it. Europe's endemic forests took millennia to flourish. In 5,000 years, we've destroyed 99% of them. In Ireland, we went the full 100. And soil, soil, that's been around for a while, until we discovered the burger. We ruin a lot of soil to grow a burger. If we keep up our hijinks, we've 50 years of farming left." A student at the back holds up his watch and calls time of death for the class. He's alternately shushed and supported by those around him. Had that been too much, too soon? A mood ring changes colour on Fionnuala's finger as she tries to prise it past the knuckle. Unsuccessfully. Alwyn had one of those once. an 18th birthday present from one of her sisters, along with the note, "This is a mood ring. If it's mostly blue on you, it's not broken. I stole it, so you can't return it, sorry. Love you, Maeve." Alwyn had heeded its warning that she needed to do better at seeming buoyant to her sisters, whose guardian she had suddenly become. She wore the ring with the stone turned towards her palm. She tries again. "Hutton showed us that we can read the landscape like a book if we know the language. Its story begins a long, long time ago, or a really, really long time ago," she says with a wink at Fionnuala. The girl is kind enough to smile as at a rose seller without buying the romance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that reading. I think we have time for some questions. So there are people walking around with mics. So if you have a question and raise your hands, we'll get a mic passed to it. Good, Kevin. And then
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Caoilinn, and such privilege to hear you reading. One thing you said earlier really stuck in my mind. You don't start with the themes. The themes come from the characters. And hope I have a simple question. I hope it's not a simplistic question. How did you get to know the characters, and which one of them did you get to know best?
Thank you for that. I just have a really weird writing process. I write in kind of one draft, and I write completely into the dark. I like to not know anything about what I'm working on. I'm usually struck by a character, and you see them in some kind of situation. And so it was Alwyn in teaching, and so what I do is I write really, really slowly, especially at the beginning. I procrastinate often for years. This is not a good thing when you've got people from your publishing house in the room to admit. But like actually, I remember for the first time ever, because I was so scared of writing this book, I just had a feeling, that it was going to be, I knew Alwyn was a sister, and then I knew I was going to show the other sisters that it was going to take years, and that it wasn't a convenient novel. It wasn't, I just wanted like a 200-page tragedy, like maybe like, because The While After was like that, and it was a really pleasurable book to write. And so I tried not to write it, and that's usually like that I can kill a few years that way. But ultimately, as my Dutch writer friend Betta Adrianza told me when I phoned her, being like, "I really don't want to write this book," she was like, "But Caoilinn, you have something in your garden, and as long as there's something there, it might be poisonous, it might be ugly, you might not like to go there and look at it, but unless you tend to it and see it to fruition, nothing else will grow in your garden." And I was like, oh, this is something in my garden. It's for women with PhDs, so for me, the circling around at the beginning, all of that work is really about testing whether there's something there in the character, and the ultimate project, I suppose, is with the novel is trying to get at the question that you're asking yourself. And I have never have any idea what that question is, really until the novel's completely done. And then I can see. And so the benefit of writing into the dark, as I do, is that you can end up in a place that you could never have set out to arrive at. And that's why I write. That discovery is essential, and all the discovery comes through, as it does for most people, but comes through other people. That's the reflection of the world. And so that's maybe why I'm a novelist, and why I write via characters in that kind of in the slow way of prose. I'd love to try writing for the screen, but I'm curious as to whether I would be able to, to write well because of the slowness that's involved, I think.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Thank you very much for a beautiful read. I have two questions. The first is, you start the novel off with the almost creation of the earth, very detailed creation. And as I'm listening to you speaking now, I'm wondering, are you mirroring the evolution of the characters in the earth itself moving forward? Oh, and the second question was, you said that taking the format of a play, the 2 acts, that allowed you to not have to add 200 more pages. So the question is, what were you able to do in a play in a short amount of pages that you couldn't do in 200? Well, you could do in 200.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
Okay, thanks.
thank you. Just on that second question first, the benefit of having met each of the sisters individually first is that by the time the reader is coming to see them together, you almost, you know them and you have expectations as to how they're going. It's like being an in-law. And you've heard for years about the others, and you've been warned and you've been told what not to say and what expectations not to have. And so I hope that that's the feeling that the reader has, that when they get there to the play part, there's so much loaded in every single exchange. And that was just such a gift, in the writing process, that the play allowed for that, and the reader's in on it. It's not something I don't think that I need to explain to them at that point. So I also almost don't think the prose would have been needed, because of the format. I also love a family reunion story. Like some of my favorite novels involve that kind of structure, and also films. Like there's a couple. Well, it was originally a play, but Tracy Letts's August Osage County and Thomas Vinterberg's Festin. If you haven't seen it, it's really, really, really recommendable. And the screen, I think, is an easier way to do that because you've got all of these other tools. You can see things, you can create pacing, you can create you can privilege certain point of views. I wasn't able to privilege any point of view in the play format, but in a way that was beneficial because then the reader can affiliate themselves with whoever they feel closest to. I wasn't really steering them. The reader will create their own journey in that. There are stage directions that are a bit lavish, let's say. I would have gotten in trouble if I was submitting it as a play. I think of it as almost halfway between a screenplay and a play script. And the first question, I'm just trying to remember. Oh yeah, I suppose, yeah. You never know whether your characters are going to change for me because you're really going into that unknown with them, and they may or they may not. I suppose with my first novel, it was a picaresque, and so it was intentionally the case that I didn't want the narrative arc to rely on her changing. I didn't want to write a coming of age. I was following a character a bit like, Moll Flanders, or, following a character moving through social space. Yes, because years pass, something changes with the character, but it's not the coming of age narrative. It's not that a character discovers their inner strength, and so therefore they can overcome these obstacles. With The Wild Laughter, my last novel, it's a monologue, and so it's the only first person piece I've ever written. I've never even written a short story in first person. And what struck me with that is, as soon as there's someone telling you a story like that, you have to think, what are the power dynamics here? And I felt he had shut the door and sat me down and said, I've got a story to tell, hear me out. And so it was already, had that level of unreliability about it. And so if he was going to grow as a character, should I believe him? Because he's controlling the narrative there. And so I suppose I'm narrativizing what it's been like in each of the novels I've written. And in this one, it could have been the case that some of the sisters, changed and evolved through the book and others didn't. And maybe that's up to the reader. Maybe some of you will think that some of them could have changed more or less. And been less malleable. And in fact, one of the sisters, Maeve, I think that's almost her fault, is that she does like float around, and she's so impressionable, and she's so gushing with love and affiliation, and she's like throwing out all these lines constantly and catching too much, but also not enough. And so I suppose you witness their individual's capacity for change. All of them have to adapt. So maybe there's a difference in that is definitely something that this book is thinking about. How are these women adapting? to the circumstances that they're in, both in their professional lives and in their personal lives, and in their own relationship to themselves, you know, to their own kind of philosophies and their own ways of coping.
Caoilinn. When you are, I was thinking as you were beginning to talk about this, about other works that involve sisters, Chekhov and Wendy Wasserstein and Little Women. Do you read those or do you run from those when you're working on something that echoes?
Yeah, when I'm working on something, I tend to steer away. But in general, I love those types of stories. But if there's something, for example, there was also that film that came out when I was writing this book about, well, two screen things. There was Bad Sisters, an Irish TV show, and I just thought, oh no, you know. But of course, it's like utterly different. And there was a show, The Lost Daughter, was yeah, I couldn't watch that because I was so worried, because Alwyn, it's not a spoiler, it's the first chapter, she leaves her partner and his kids and takes off on her bicycle and at the beginning of the book. So I was really worried about that question of, I didn't know how much the book would have to do with, can you leave your you know, the people you're steward of, or you know, your guardian of. Ultimately it isn't about that, but I didn't know, and I wanted to be open to that becoming more central in the story, so I couldn't watch that. So I do tend to avoid a little bit when I'm reading, when I'm writing. I like to just read stuff that keeps raising the bar, you know, that I could, it's both demoralizing because I could never write something that good, but also that raises the bar.
Thank you. Your reading was beautiful. And I was interested in how you attempted eye contact with us. I'm curious about that, where that comes from. And then also, I was also really curious about your process in when you're writing. Do you read out loud to yourself? Do you hear it in your head? What's the oral component?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess because I started out reading poetry and plays, I didn't really read novels until I was 18. That's kind of when I started reading novels. And I read poetry and plays because I'm a really slow reader, and I found novels to be intimidating. And I found them to have, they contained everything that they needed. They didn't need a reader. This was my impression as a young person. And they even contained their own description on the back. And so, you know, I would just kind of read the back of the book and pretend that I'd read it, you know. I had really no time for novels. And whereas poetry and plays had these large margins, and I felt that they were for you. It was a space for you to enter. And I felt it was so intimate, and I just felt that nobody else was picking out those little slender books. They were just a slice. And so it just felt like there was an act that you could feel your own act of reading, that there was some kind of vulnerability you were entering into, and some kind of generosity involved in that kind of transaction as a reader. And so I'm describing it like this now, but I even think as a kid, I might have like not been able to put it like that, but I felt really strongly about those thin books with lots of space. And so I guess I'm interested, I write for a reader. I'm not one of those writers who can just, you know, have a vague sense, or are writing for themselves. I'm really thinking of a reader the whole time. It's like participant on the other end, and the work isn't complete without the reader. Like, it doesn't make sense if, you know, the book continues to be in print, you know, and throughout time, but no one's reading it, then the book is dead, you know, to me. So, because of that reading pace, because I started reading poetry, I read prose in the same way. And I read, you know, with the ear in mind, for how it sounds, and I do read aloud once I have completed something, just to find any kind of false notes. And especially to hear a character's voice. Like sometimes you would write a line of dialogue and it's it's convenient for the scene. It does something in the scene and then it sounds good or it's funny. But if it's not true to the character, you can actually you can lose a novel that way because the characters starts to not work and then everything just starts to break down and you can't pinpoint what it is, but you just have writer's block then. So for me, yeah, the way someone, if I'm ever teaching fiction, I always think, about teaching dialogue. If, you've got a stain on your carpet in your dorm room in college and someone walks in and it's your mother and how is she going to address the stain? Been getting out much? Like, how would your best friend address the stain? Like, there's so many ways to show how individual we are, how much people are just quirky, and that no two people really say the same thing, because it's not just about the words that you choose; it's about the angle. It's about so many things. So for me, getting the sound of the characters right is key, and it's not just in what they say; it's also in the way that they see the world. The fact that they're, that opening image of the wind whistling at the labs of the pane of the panes of the lab windows, like an unwelcome uncle, raising the hairs on some young neck, or that kind of is an unnerving image. And so even before I knew Alwyn, they were the first lines I wrote. It came out like that. But already it was telling me something about Alwyn, that she's in this moment of, it's being funny. She's being funny, but it's also, there's something very troubling about it. And so the whole voice is there in every line. So I suppose this is just a long way of saying that I do really write for sound, and I love the idea that the reader is hearing it,
We have time maybe for one more.
Hey, Caoilinn. And hi, Kelly. That was wonderful conversation. Having had a chance to hear you read a couple of times and being a fangirl, I'm thinking about what seems like a bit of a two-track process where you're writing into the dark, as you say, and the story's coming to you through one character, then the other. It's coming. You're behind the story, right? Not in front of it. But on the other hand, as Kelly made clear when she walked us through the characters, these people are experts in certain things. And so if you don't know that the character, so how does the writing into the dark part work beside the necessity of having a fake expertise? In this case, not just one, but four.
Yeah.
And I've heard you talk about some of these things, like that's real knowledge. And because it's dialogue, because you write such incredible dialogue, as you just explained, it has to ring true to somebody who might actually be a geologist or a teacher of that or whatever. So in terms of your process, what happens? Do you just then go off and spend 3 months learning about, citizens' assemblies and how, or the thing that she told me that just blew my mind was she wrote a letter of rejection from a science journal. Like this just cracks me up. But does that not derail you then from the writing process, that you have to then become, a geologist for a few months, and then the next sister, you've got to become a Brexit era chef? And then, I'm just curious, how do those parts work in terms of your process?
Oh yeah, well, thanks, Stephanie. I'm a huge procrastinator. So so far, I've always just written novels that are leaning into areas of expertise that expertise is a very strong word, but like areas of interest, let's say. And there was just a number of geology books that I'd read over the years. Basin and Range, probably a number of people in the room have read it, by John McPhee. It's an extraordinary book, and he's not a geologist, and there's this one line in it. If I'm not going to, I'm hoping my brain will deliver the line now. He said, if I can boil all of this down, if I have to boil all of this book down into one sentence, the sentence would be: the top of the summit of Mount Everest is marine limestone. And, that just contains the whole sense of wonder and like mind-bendingness and the scale. He coined the term deep time in that book from 1982. So that book, and then another much more recent book by Helen Gordon called Deep Time: Journeys Through Our Past and Future Worlds. That was another book that there was just the odd little detail. One detail in particular that like arose in a really key scene really late in the book, that without having read that book, I wouldn't have been able to complete the scene. And then you just feel ecstatic as a writer because you feel like all the constellation of your life has come together, you know, in this beautiful, it's just so rewarding when that happens. But so I leaned into areas that I already was interested in. The citizens' assemblies, I just have these horrible memories of myself after too many glasses of wine. In fact, in America, because it's that tool of direct democracy is less known here. It's very well known in Ireland. Everyone has some sense of what a citizens' assembly is. But I remember kind of mouthing off to someone in a bar, you know, well, what you need to have is proportional representation. And then, you know, just so weirdly, it's also something I've been really interested in. And I suppose you try and find that's in an effort to be hopeful and to have a sense that we can actually do better than we're currently doing. That's maybe why I had like imaginatively latched onto that. I would say the character and philosophy. I mean, my very first lecture that I ever went to, when I only really read poetry and plays, but I went to this lecture in Queens my very first day, and I asked a question, and on the way out of the lecture hall, the context is I had done really badly in school and I'd not gotten into college. So I went to Northern Ireland because they only counted 2 of your grades. And I didn't even have those grades. I had a B- in English. So I went from that context of not having been someone that, you know, the education sat well with, to having a PhD, and it all happened on this first day of college, where I asked this question as I was leaving the lecture hall along with 200 other people. The lecturer called me over and said, "That question you asked makes me think you like this book. It's called America by Jean Baudrillard. It's in the library. Go seek America, report back." And then the following week, I didn't go up to him or anything, but he beckoned me over and he said, "So," and I had found the book, and it was a philosophy book. And so it began my acquaintance with that shelf, you know, in the library. And it was also just like an extraordinary moment of transformation of what education is about, but recognizing someone is interested in something and trying to foster and cultivate that. And finally, for Maeve, that was the chef. That was the one I had to do the most research for, because I am vegetarian, and she's not just a vegetarian cook. So I had to really think, like, try and be magnanimous.
I had to learn how to cook chicken recently because my dog was sick. So there, needs must. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you, Caoilinn, for this wonderful book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Riverhead for publishing the book.
Woo.
And go buy a copy if you would like. And I think, Caoilinn, you'll sign some copies.
We'd be happy
If
to.
that's okay. Well, there's a table out in the front.
And thank you so much, Kelly, and to the Glucksman Ireland House for having me. It's been a dream to be in here, so I'm really, really happy. Thank you.
Thank you.